Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan. Welcome back to the bunker. It's time once again to dive into the ever-cyclical and always uncertain comic vault. Today, on request, we're going to take a look at the 5-issue miniseries from 1986 of The Punisher. This is The Punisher's first standalone story as far as I'm aware, and this was a thing that was kind of difficult to get off the ground in 1986. Broke a lot of the standard comics code rules, and Marvel wasn't totally sure if they were going to publish it, and even when they decided to, they weren't totally sure if they were even going to promote it, but comics were starting to get darker and grittier and accepting more of these kind of gritty crime stories because of all of the rampant crime and urban upheaval that was happening at the time. And I think Frank Miller, of course, really kind of set the stage for this and kind of paved the way, created a lot of precedent for this kind of story to be allowed to be told. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in this Punisher mini that at the time would have been very surprising in its violence and even in its sexual content. And not that you see a whole lot of either. This is one of the rougher stories, I think, not just in subject matter, but even in what you see in the panels that I've read from this period, but of course, pretty tame by today's standards. Still not a thing that I would hand to a little kid or even like a preteen. I think it's even too graphic for that age group, and was kind of impressive that Marvel allowed Stephen Grant and the writer Stephen Grant, artist Mike Zeck, to put this book out at the time. As far as sexuality goes, you get a scene where the Punisher is talking to a woman who he gets involved with here, who ends up double-crossing him. It's very 007. I think this whole story is actually structured in a kind of a James Bondian sort of way. Not to get too ahead of myself yet, but this this woman from this organization called the Trust that is trying to recruit the Punisher to this kind of civilian group to try to win his war for him, basically. Do the things that the police can't do, no matter who gets in the way. There's this woman that's part of that group that kind of seduces the Punisher and tries to get him more involved. And anyway, there's a scene where they're talking, and she says, "Everything that is mine is yours, everything." And then we cut to her lying in a bed. You see her from behind. She's clearly nude, and that implies that they've had sex. That was a big deal right then, being published by a mainstream comic company, and so a lot of things like that happen here that you wouldn't usually see. Suicide, child getting killed accidentally, but still these things were kind of unusual, and it does not revel in those things. It doesn't read gratuitous at all. All those things serve the story and need to be there to create the kind of violent world that the Punisher inhabits, for us to appreciate how conflicted he is about the violent things that he's doing in killing each of the criminals that he comes up to. The Punisher's more conflicted than I've really read of this character, and interesting that it goes back this far. I found him kind of more compelling and more human, more sympathetic than I have in some other stories, because he's really questioning the things he's doing and asking kind of that Batman question of, am I actually accomplishing anything, or am I just making this worse? Like, what is my real motivation for going after criminals? Is it to actually solve any problems, or is it just because I'm so tormented and jaded because of what happened to my family that I have to keep doing this, regardless of whether or not I'm actually solving any problems? And it's a really introspective Punisher. But again, kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. So this was requested by TheDayGhost on Patreon, Austin. So thanks a bunch for asking me to read this. This is a thing I've always been kind of curious about and just never gotten around to sitting down and reading. This really surprised me as I said, because it's not a whole lot like a lot of the more recent stories that I've read, and it kept kind of subverting my expectations and going, it was pretty unpredictable. It kept going in places I didn't expect it to. For instance, the first issue is oversized. And it's like 45 pages. And I should mention, by the way, this is a 5-issue miniseries that will dupe you, if you're reading it in issues, into thinking that it's only 4, because I think, first, third, and fourth issue have a misprint on the top that say the first in a 4-issue miniseries, but then there is an issue 5. And that confused me, and I thought maybe that fifth issue came out a lot later or something, and was like this tacked-on epilogue or something. It's not. It is indeed a 5-issue story, and I guess originally the plan was supposed to be for the first and fourth issue to both be oversized, like that first issue is, and then the 3 in the middle would be normal 22-page comic books. And what happened instead, for whatever reason, is that 4 and 5 were split off into 2, and it may have had something to do with who had time to work on what when, because, again, Grant and Zeck did the first 4 issues completely, and then there's another artist that comes in to finish it with the 5th issue, and there's another writer that comes in to help out even in stories. So I was kind of curious about that. It's kind of peculiar, and I'm not sure what exactly the story is with that. But I suspect that may have something to do with why that last issue was split into 2. And so Mike Vosberg comes in and draws that last issue. He does a spectacular job in kind of aping the same style that Zeck is doing. I barely noticed it. It didn't take me out. I didn't find it really jarring. And I think that he's doing the same kind of cinematic storyboarding type stuff that Zeck is doing. And this is right in line with Zeck's artwork in books like Craven's Last Hunt. I like Mike Zeck a lot. I never think of Mike Zeck as one of my favorite artists, but maybe he is, because I love everything that I've seen from him that he's worked on. He also worked on Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, and I guess I don't love that as much, but this kind of darker, grittier, more shadowy stuff, this is kind of where he lives. This is where he shines the most. And it was really a treat to get to see him on Punisher, and I can see why the Punisher ended up being such a long-lasting character after this, because this is a really memorable, especially the visual storytelling, but also the story is pretty good too, comic book, and it really creates this tone and mood and atmosphere that I can see why a lot of writers and artists kind of latched onto and continued to kind of push forward. And again, I think a lot of the Punisher tropes that, depending on how you want to look at it, that complement or plague the Punisher books after this kind of come later. This is a difficult thing to follow up, because the Punisher has a character arc that's actually about him going through some real change, and I'm used to the Punisher being, again, kind of like Batman, a character that refuses to change, who thinks that who's kind of lost some degree of his humanity. There are lines he won't cross, certainly. He doesn't want innocence to die. And this is all about that. I'm not saying that this is inconsistent with the character later. I'm saying that this is sort of like early Spider-Man, where it feels like it wants to have an ending, and then it's kind of forced to continue on like a constantly serialized narrative that has to keep repeating itself and finding ways to start over and retcon and reinvent, because you have to keep telling Punisher stories. He's not that kind of character yet. The idea of a Punisher standalone story was new and not expected and not obligatory. And so at the time, the Punisher is kind of a villain first. And, you know, he appears first in a Spider-Man comic as a bad guy, and he's certainly, even there, I think, more of an anti-hero than he is just a straight villain, but you wouldn't expect to want to get from his perspective and get a lot of stories about him. and it's really counter to the, you know, kind of heroic Marvel method, where the good guys always win, and now we've got like massive shades of gray. Obviously, again, Frank Miller kind of creates a lot of precedent, sets the stage for this with Daredevil, who has a lot more of that kind of shades of gray even in Miller's stuff. So he's not a straight up anti-hero, of course, but there's some moral ambiguity there that even in Marvel, which at the time is more about trying to create a kind of more believable or realistic novels, relatively, with superhero characters that feel more like, you know, complicated, sometimes conflicted people that are more like people who are around in real life, as opposed to one-dimensional, stalwart, always do the right thing heroes like you had a little bit more in DC. Obviously, at this point in the 80s, DC has some of those as well. You look at Green Arrow during this period, and he's practically a Marvel character. But I guess I just mean the traditions of Marvel. Punisher is very much pushing against those, and even still, you know, fits in better in this world than he would in something like DC. And so if you're going to tell a Punisher story in this time period, you don't have to concern yourself as much with how do we continue to tell stories about this character, create a status quo and a you know, character who doesn't change so much so we can tell, you know, a million stories with him like you're already kind of dealing with Spider-Man and some other characters. And so, like I said, this is a Punisher who changes. This is a Punisher who has a character arc where he decides that maybe he doesn't need to kill criminals every time, that maybe punishment, I mean, he continues to call himself the Punisher, but his attitude about punishment changes. Maybe it's not always about that. Maybe there's a cycle of violence that I'm perpetuating by always worrying about simply eliminating threats instead of changing hearts and minds. So the Punisher doesn't end this series becoming like exactly the same kind of crusader that Batman is, where he's like, I'm going to start inspiring you know, other people to do the right thing. It's not that at all, but he starts to question, at the very least, he's getting more contemplative and trying to be maybe a little bit more responsible in what kind of an influence he's having, because he ends up being faced with this horrifying kind of, I don't want to say cult, but this organization of people who create copycat Punishers that are kind of a twisted perversion of what he's doing. And putting things into perspective, it makes the Punisher look like Batman. It makes the Punisher look like he is the sane one of some of the vigilantes in this city that are trying to actually stop organized crime. And you know, from his perspective, it makes you start to see the Punisher as a real hero, even in what he was doing before, where he just straight up kills any bad person that he's able to get his hands on, as opposed to giving them a chance to take an opportunity for change and be better. Because, of course, the Punisher, because Frank Castle had something horrible happen to his family, not his parents, he's not Batman, to his family, to his wife and children, because of organized crime. It was a deal gone wrong, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, his family dies, and he has this kind of a conflict of motivations, this contradictory thing where simultaneously he wants to punish criminals and particularly organized crime, but he also wants to see organized crime go away, and he wants to you know, solve the corruption in the city. And those two things don't really go together, and he's faced with that head on in this story because he has inspired this organization to do what he's doing on a grander scale, but they're learning kind of the wrong lessons from him. And like I said, it's really interesting that you could have perversions of the Punisher, where it makes what he does look kind of more pure, and of course at the same time it kind of proves to the Punisher that what he's doing isn't working, and that it really isn't enough just to take out the bad men. You have to actually, change how people look at things. And so the first, I want to say the first story, it reads like a standalone story until it starts to kind of pay off as the book continues. That first issue, that oversized issue, like I said, it's called Circle of Blood. The whole thing should be called that, and because that's kind of thematically what the whole thing is about. It's cycle of violence, circle of blood. The Punisher himself, even though he's made his entire life about blood, is really sick of it. It's like I said, it's not working. And so in that first issue, and by the way, I think it's interesting that this is a Punisher who doesn't call himself Frank Castle. There's one scene where he says, Frank Castle died when he lost his family, and I am the Punisher. And he's kind of separated himself from his own humanity, which makes it easier for him to be cold and emotionless. And of course, he's not emotionless. He's fueled with passion for taking out, evil men. But in his mind, I think it makes it easier to cope. He kind of compartmentalizes things so that, if he doesn't think of himself as a human being, but rather kind of like a Grim Reaper, or a Wraith in the Night, it makes it easier for him to be the Punisher. And he's kind of discovering again that he maybe needs some of that humanity to get what he really wants, which again makes him more sympathetic, because it reads by the end of this like maybe he actually does care more about solving the city's crime problem more than he cares about his vendetta. This is in its way almost an revenge thriller, revenge story, and I don't know, I think maybe I appreciated this even more than I would have if I'd read it back in 1986, assuming that I had been old enough to. I was 2, but like if I was an adult and had read this in 86, I wouldn't have had all of these other Punisher stories that this reads like it's subverting now, reading it all these years later. So in that first issue, the Punisher goes to prison, and he's been there before. It seems like building really well on some previous continuity, although I've not read much of the Punisher stuff from Spider-Man and any other books he might have been in. I don't know if he had already appeared in Daredevil at this point. I would assume so. He's already wrapped up with the Kingpin. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I expected this to be a really Kingpin-heavy story, and then the Kingpin as an idea is important, but the character doesn't even appear, which shocked me. And anyway, so he's been in prison before, and when he was there the first time, he got drugged. And so now that he's back, he is hoping to find the person that drugged him so that he can get revenge on that person. I like that this starts from a revenge place and ends very far away from that. And he discovers that the person who got the cook in the prison to drug him in the first place is Jigsaw. And Jigsaw is wrapped up with a crime boss who's also in the prison, who's working on an escape plan. And so Punisher initially goes after Jigsaw and then kind of stops. There's this kind of horrific scene where he breaks a glass in Jigsaw's hand. I feel like I see that in a lot of Punisher things after this. Of course, this whole prison setting is a thing that has been adapted in other things with the Punisher and is maybe the most recognizable thing in this. As is the way Jigsaw talks. I remember when we first got the trailers for Punisher Warzone, and Vince was complaining that he had this ridiculous overdone Brooklyn accent, and it is really silly. But then reading this, that's kind of the voice in my head. At least in this book, is a really kind of exaggerated, over the top sort of Jigsaw, and he's really one note. I should mention, and I haven't, again, read the stuff where he appears before, so maybe there's a little bit more to this character, a little bit more dimension, but as it reads here, just with what I have, it's simply the Punisher and Jigsaw got in a fight at some point. Jigsaw was a really attractive man where the women were always throwing themselves at him, and then Punisher messed up his face, and now he can't get laid anymore, so he's really upset about that, and he wants to do the same thing to the Punisher's face. And that's it. You know, there's not a whole lot of substance there. I don't know how Jigsaw got this way besides how he got his face messed up, but I mean, I don't know why he's such a, you know, nasty, violent, horrible criminal. I don't know how he got there. And so, anyway, not a super compelling character or anything, but what's done with him later when we get into the Trust, again, this organization that is kind of taking the Punisher's methods even farther, I almost said too far, but much farther than the Punisher did. That gets kind of interesting, so I'll get there in a second, but it reads like a just real standard Prison Break story until you get further into the miniseries and you realize that a lot of what happens and what matters later is set up here in the first place. So it establishes Jigsaw, who's going to matter later, and it establishes right at the end, in a cliffhanger, a character who, again, I assume probably showed up in a book previous to this, I don't know, a character named Tony, whose father has been killed by the Punisher and who doesn't initially really want to get revenge on him, but is pressured by his mob family. It's your really standard, stereotypical Italian thing again, just like Frankie Cavelli or Cavella, I think, in the Punisher Max series that I reviewed a couple months ago. And this guy just wants to go to school and be a doctor, and he's kind of forced into this revenge thriller thing, which, again, is really interesting, the way that this is kind of an anti-traditional revenge story. And he ends up kind of turning on a dime. It's a little bit silly in the scene where it's like, no, you know what, you're right, I am really angry with the Punisher, and I'm gonna go kill him just like you told me I should. Like, that is a guy who is easily caving to peer pressure. And so the Punisher agrees to be part of the breakout, but doesn't realize. Well, I guess he actually kind of expected this would happen. But it turns out that this mob boss working with Jigsaw is actually planning on killing the Punisher before he has any chance of helping them escape because they don't trust him. And this leads to one of the sillier moments in the book. This is a thing that reads like it wants to be a pretty serious, relatively grounded, relatively realistic crime drama, but it cuts corners in some places where it thinks it can get away with some silly leaps in logic that I don't think I can suspend my disbelief for just because it's a comic book. So it kind of uses the medium as a crutch and says, well, we're hoping that people take us seriously, but the internal logic is that it's a comic book, and so it makes some kind of Stan Lee leaps in kind of how physics work and stuff that I don't buy really within the context of the story I'm reading. I think that this is too serious, and overall, it kind of drags the material down a little bit when it makes these kinds of, it kind of creates these plot devices that make it easier for the Punisher to get out of places and reads kind of, goofy soap opera. So there's a couple of these I want to mention, and I guess I'll go ahead and do that here because that's one of my major complaints about this story. The first one is the Punisher kind of suspects that he might get double-crossed by Jigsaw, or maybe in his internal monologue he's just kind of covering his bases for whoever might be reading his monologue. Oh no, I knew that was gonna happen. I saw that coming. So the guy that the kind of thug that tries to kill the Punisher is using a homemade silencer, and because it's a like with like a Coke bottle or something, and because it's a homemade silencer, the Punisher knows that it will slow the bullets down, and that when they hit his blanket, they won't actually go through his skin because the bullets will be so much slower, they won't even pierce his skin. Like, not only does it not kill him, I don't think he even really gets bullet wounds. I don't think he even quite gets shot. But even if he does, you can't be sure that, like, judging distance and stuff, you're absolutely going to make it out of that alive. He doesn't know how close that guy is going to be standing to him, and just the idea that it would, even if it did slow the bullets down, and I looked into this a little bit, apparently older silencers that could happen with, I couldn't really find anything on homemade silencers, but like modern silencers don't slow down bullets apparently hardly at all, or like it's so negligible that it wouldn't really make a difference. But I cried foul really hard with that. I thought that was really silly. And there are a couple places like that here and there. This organization, The Trust, it turns out what they're doing is, at first I thought it was just a bunch of copycat Punishers. And like it was kind of that Dark Knight thing, and they had all gotten together, and they're going a lot further than the Punisher would, and they're just killing anybody that gets in their way. And Punisher is, by the way, again, one of the reasons he's second guessing himself is because these guys are letting innocents get caught in the crossfire. And the Punisher is realizing that it's because of him that they got to this, and that's never what he wanted. And so he helps the Trust at first in creating a gang war, because he thinks that if they can just, you know, let all the criminals kill each other, then his work will be done for him. So they call up a newspaper and they let the public think that the Punisher has killed the Kingpin. And so now you have all these other criminals that come up and try to take the Kingpin's place. And when that happens, they all start taking each other out. And it's a good plan, I guess, if you don't care about anybody, if you don't care about collateral damage at all. But of course, the Punisher does care about that. And he finds out that these guys have gone so far as to basically mind control, but in a more believable way than your classic, you know, comic book mind control. Nobody's got like a device that you put on somebody's head and it messes with their brain and makes them go do stuff. There's not anything like Mad Hatter in here. What happens instead is that there is this really messed up conditioning that involves torture, where the Trust is taking, and not innocent people, violent criminals that they just want to like use as guns and point in the right direction. But again, it makes them create more collateral damage, and they mess with their brains. They put them, they strip them nude, they put them on a floor, they gas them, and then they do this Pavlovian conditioning where they make them think that they're the Punisher by just constantly repeating that a question of who are you, and giving them negative reinforcement if they say anything but the Punisher. And that's where Jigsaw comes in later. He is put into this program and comes to believe that he is the Punisher also. And so you have all these guys in Punisher suits that go out and kill anything that gets in their way to get to mobsters and other criminals. And toward the end, when the Punisher finds Jigsaw and they go at it for a minute, Jigsaw is broken out of his conditioning because he hates the Punisher so much. And I actually, it's very comic book, but I actually kind of bought that whole thing. And it's, I don't know, it's kind of a fun scene when he finds his insane nutso Jigsaw-ness again. But anyway, one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that the Punisher is kind of starting to lose himself at the beginning and doesn't realize it, where there's this ambiguous scene, and I like that it's ambiguous the more I'm thinking about it. At first I wasn't sure about it, but I think I'm digging it more as I'm considering it, where the Punisher is in a position to kill the warden at this prison, who, if memory serves, isn't part of this whole thing and is, you know, relatively innocent. And he's trying to get to this mob boss who is trying to escape. And the Punisher threatens to kill this guy, and the mobster doesn't believe him, and he just kind of looks in his eyes and eventually decides, oh man, the Punisher's you know, really lost it, he's unhinged. He actually really is going to you know, shoot my hostage if I don't drop my gun. So he ends up calling Punisher's bluff and drops his gun, assuming it's a bluff. I'm actually not really sure in the scene. I think the Punisher maybe actually would have killed that guy, which seems against his code, because he doesn't like collateral damage. He doesn't want innocents to get in the way. And just after this scene where it seems like he may be compromising that, he's going up against this organization that is all about collateral damage. Ends justifies the means. These civilian vigilantes who think that the way to win Punisher's war is to break, kind of his one rule. And so then we get, like I said, this really conflicted Punisher, and throughout the story, he's starting to see that he's not really solving any problems. So the first thing the Punisher does that's kind of contrary to his usual MO is he decides to maybe try to work with this group. Now, it's weird because at the end of the first issue, the big cliffhanger seems to be, yeah, I'm going to work with this group. And then the whole second issue is, I don't know, I'm not sure. And it doesn't seem like he's second-guessing that choice. It seems like he didn't make it in the first place. So that, unless I'm missing something, that read a little bit contradictory to me, where it seemed like he backtracks, where I saw him make this decision, and then the next issue he's trying to decide if he's going to make this decision. So that was kind of weird. But the Punisher, of course, usually works alone, and he's already wanting to change his usual way of operating, because he's realizing that he's not actually accomplishing anything, and he's, I think, starting to worry that maybe he's turning too much into a monster. And so he gets caught in this really vulnerable position where he starts to fall for this woman, Angela, who we don't spend enough time with to really get any kind of a chemistry for these two. It really reads like kind of an obligatory relationship. And then the big cliffhanger at the end of the issue where they sleep together is, oh man, she's actually working for, what's his name? Alarak, the leader of the Trust, and that she is really there just to seduce him to do what they're wanting. And eventually she's going to double-cross him and try to shoot him when when he's not doing what they want. He's eventually, initially working with them, and then when he realizes that too many civilians are getting in the way, he decides to stop trying to win his war and start trying to take them down. And so now they've got the Punisher to contend with, and they've got to try to kill the Punisher while simultaneously using their own Punishers to kill criminals. So when you get to the end of the story, the Punisher has a couple of choices to make. He has to decide if he's going to kill the leader of the Trust, and if he is, well, actually, it's mostly just, is he going to keep, worrying more about punishment than he is about trying to take down organized crime and, to cause some real lasting change. And so he's not going to straight up kill the leader of the Trust in cold blood. And he ends up having a speech to that Tony guy who finally shows up at the end to try to kill him. Maybe his timing showing up is maybe a little bit convenient, but he pops in at the end, and the Punisher is like, okay, I could just go ahead and kill you, or you could go ahead and kill me, but why don't you work more on living than killing? Why don't you start worrying about living your life? And it's a speech, of course, designed to save his own life, but he's also talking about himself as much as he is this Tony guy in that scene, and he's trying to finally maybe do something to stop this cycle of violence. And it's like, yes, I killed your father, and now you're gonna kill me, and if I was anybody else, there would be somebody else that would try to avenge me, and this cycle just keeps going and going and going. What exactly are we really accomplishing finally? And so then when you get to the very end, you have this tragic scene that, again, is a little soap opera-ish, but I think I like it, where the Punisher kind of puts Angela in a position where her car is about to careen off an edge and she's going to die because she thinks that he has killed the leader of the Trust, her lover. Of course, I liked it. It's called The Trust because you absolutely can't trust them, of course. And she's about to careen off this edge in her car and die. And the Punisher could just go ahead and kill her because she double-crossed him and kind of, you know, ripped his heart out of his chest, but also tried to kill him. I think he's probably more concerned with, you know, breaking his heart than even trying to murder him. And he does that Batman Begins thing, where instead of just straight up killing her, he's like, I'm not going to kill you, but I don't have to save you. He does that whole thing. And so he still essentially condemns her to death, but he's learning, so it's not the straight-up revenge that you usually get with the Punisher. I mean, I guess it's sort of a loophole, because there's no way she's going to make it out of this alive, but it's maybe a good first step for the Punisher. And I like that he doesn't do this complete 180 and have, like, this big declaration at the end, like, I'm no longer going to kill anymore, and, like, now I'm just straight-up Batman. No more guns! You know, it's not that. You get the sense that the Punisher is still going to kill when he thinks he has to, but I would argue that by the end of the story, I'm not even sure that it makes sense for him to keep calling himself the Punisher anymore. So I don't totally know what stories you would tell with this character after this that wouldn't make you have to kind of retcon this character arc a little bit, and I would be maybe a little bit curious to see how that's handled in the ongoing that happens in '87 after this, after the popularity of this miniseries. But just this as a standalone story, I got this kind of really nice, subtle for, you know, Marvel Comics in the mid-'80s character arc where the Punisher realizes that the punishing part of what he's doing is kind of causing more problems than it's solving. I like the art in this a lot. I think it's a really thrilling, exciting book. It's got some pacing issues, particularly in the first issue. I think it really sags in the middle, and I get kind of tired of the prison break plot, where it's just, you know, every single detail of trying to get out of this prison, and I think there's about 10 pages where my eyes glaze over and it kind of loses me. I don't think that issue really needed to be oversized the way it is. I think issues 4 and 5 absolutely do need to be as long as they are, and I don't think this could have been done in 4. And once we get into that second issue, I found myself getting a lot more engaged, especially with the lack of Kingpin stuff, which I know sounds kind of weird, but right at the beginning of the second issue, the Punisher goes in to take out the Kingpin. And it's all staged, and it turns out that who he thinks is the Kingpin isn't, and then there's this explosion, and so you know, somebody else posing as the Kingpin has been killed, and that's what allows the Trust to pretend like the Punisher has killed the Kingpin. And it's almost like he gets framed for a thing that he would have done had he had the opportunity to, but framed isn't like exactly the right word. It's kind of fun, and then you really expect the Kingpin to actually show up somewhere in the story, and he's using like proxy bosses. I don't even really know where he is right now. That is one thing I did keep kind of asking myself, is like, I kind of get why the Punisher would want to lay low while all this is happening, or why Kingpin would want to lay low while all this is happening, because like his competition is probably taking each other out right now, and so when the dust settles and he comes back in and people know that he's alive again, he's going to have like a lot less you know, competition and carnage to deal with. But I would have liked to have known like where he was and what he was doing, but that might have required a scene where we cut to him, and since he's not really involved in this story, it's maybe for the best that we didn't do that. So I'm sure something else after this probably covers that. Maybe it's in Daredevil somewhere. I have no idea. Like, I'm just limited to the knowledge of what I have with this story. But I did kind of wonder what was going on with him, and then by the end, I kind of appreciated that it wasn't a story about the Kingpin. It's a more internalized story about how the Punisher is dealing with the fact that his this plan with the Trust is working. and it unsettles him, and he can't deal with it, and I think that's fantastic. So yeah, like I said, some goofy leaps in logic and a little bit of pacing issues, but otherwise I really enjoyed this. I thought it was quite good. So anyway, thanks everybody a lot for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you have read this story, I'd love to know your opinion of it there in the comments. If you would like to make a request yourself, you become a $15 patron at patreon.com/geekvolution. If you want to pledge just for 1 month, that will get you a request on the list, and if you want to be a part of the regular rotation, you can stay at the $15 tier if you so decide. Just understand that I don't have the time to do monthly requests for everybody that is on that list, so I just cycle through the names, and if you stay on the list, you'll already have a spot reserved, so you'll get a request every 2 to 3 months, just depending on how many people I have on the list. At the moment, I have, I think, somewhere between 12 and 15, so once every 3 months or so, you should get one, and then I hit the one-time ones when I get to the end of that regular list. So anyway, thanks a lot, everybody, for watching, and of course, once again, you can do that with comics, or you can do that with movies as well. So let me know if you're interested in that, and in the meantime, I will see you again with another Comic Vault in the not-too-distant future. I am Captain Logan, and happy reading.